Hi everyone, welcome to Money and Me podcast by the Coin Republic. I'm your host and the editor in chief of the Coin Republic, Varuni, and we have yet another super interesting guest from the Web3 crypto and blockchain space. We have Erick Watson from Randamu with us this fine evening. How are you doing, Eric?
Hi, Varuni. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Lovely. It's lovely to have you on our show, and I look forward to hearing all about yourself and Randamu. But before that, I like to ask my guests how they entered this rabbit hole of a space that is Web3, crypto, and blockchain. So, if you can talk a little bit about that switch that you made from probably Web2 or wherever you were before
hmm
this rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent most of my career in the Web 2 world at places like Microsoft and Google.
Hmm.
And one day I got a call from a company called Protocol Labs. And at the time, I didn't realize it, but they were the creators of Filecoin. And so they had a very interesting opportunity for me regarding the spin out of a team from their organization to start a new startup. And I had been dabbling in startups for several years over the course of my career, and it sounded really fun and interesting. And this particular group that they wanted to spin out was focused on publicly verifiable randomness, which is a very niche technology that most people haven't even heard of, much less realize that they use on a daily basis. And so that led me down a very deep rabbit hole of studying randomness and how it's generated and why it's important in computation and the different ways that we use randomness. And that's actually one of the reasons why we named the company Randamu, because it's got its start related to randomness. But since that time, it's turned into so much more, and I could have never guessed at the onset of this journey quite how interesting it would become. And then I got to meet all of the Web3 degens and the culture that's built up around Web3 that I had no idea even existed at the time that I joined the company. And so for me, it's been quite a learning journey.
Wow, if you don't mind me asking, how long has it been since you came into Randomo? And I always keep this
Mhm,
question for the end where I ask my guests, how did
mhm,
you name this company? But we've already had that answered. It's definitely a great name, and I'm all about randomness to say the least. And I've not seen a lot of people respect randomness, which
mm,
I think it's the ethos of nature. But it's
mhm.
great that you guys have built something around it, and would love to know how long it has been for you in Web3. And as an outsider, you've been in
Mhm.
Microsoft and some of the big fours, fives. How was it as an outsider being part of the culture?
Yeah, I would say there were a couple of different things that are very different. So when I first joined, I came in to answer your question directly. It's been just under 3 years. So when I first started at Protocol Labs, it was the first thing I noticed about the culture was that it was very pro learning and supportive culture, much more so than some of the companies that I had worked for in the past. In fact, everyone was sort of learning together and very interested in supporting one another. And so I felt very welcome and supported in my journey by everyone that I got to work with. In fact, to this day, I've met very few people that I would even classify as disagreeable, much less non supportive, right? So I think there is something special about the Web3 community in terms of its openness to new learning and growth. And so when I started, to answer your other question about the name Randamu, it arrived rather strangely because one of our co-founders is a big fan of Japanese culture, and so he hit upon the idea that Randamu sounds like a Japanese person transliterating the word randomness. And in fact, we discovered later after we named the company that that is not how Japanese people say the word randomness, but it stuck. The name stuck, and so it sounds like something you might hear in a Japanese anime. Um, but yeah, I would say other cultural changes are things regarding how Web3 evolved through a series of conferences because everyone is so remote and typically working from home. And there's very few facilities in which people dedicate themselves to developing Web3 communities and companies. There's just not a one area of critical mass anywhere on the planet that everyone gets together. And so as a result, there's this community culture where everyone comes together at the conferences. And so going to these conferences, attending conferences, meeting people for the first time in person at conferences became a hallmark of joining the Web3 community that I think is substantially different than the Web2 community.
Absolutely. And communitization has been one of the core concepts of Web3, I think, right from where Bitcoin evolved. And you rightly mentioned meeting all the degens, and earlier they were called Bitcoin maximalists. They still are called
Mhm.
that. And of course, the meme coin communities are one of the craziest ones. So
Oh
you
yeah.
rightly uh, communities are definitely one of the core concepts of Web3. Talking about core concepts, if you can talk a little bit about Randamu, what the core
Mhm.
concept and vision behind the company is. Of course, cryptographic solutions is one word
Mhm.
that I could get that I could get from reading a bit about it. But if
Mhm.
you can explain that to, let's say, someone who's not a Web3 native, how would you do that?
Sure. Yeah, I would say, well, the key insight that Randamu has is regarding the current underutilization of threshold cryptography. And so, for someone that may be new to the Web3 community, threshold cryptography is a type of cryptography in which multiple computers have to agree that something is true or false before that transaction becomes a committed transaction. And so, in most computational environments, there's usually just one or maybe a small handful of computers, all owned by a single entity, that have to agree to something before a transaction gets committed. So whether that's an AP, like for example, maybe I'm on my cell phone and I'm using Google Maps to navigate my way around a new city. Google Maps doesn't distribute that transaction across multiple companies. All the computers there are owned by Google. So when I go from one place to another in a given town, I have to trust that Google knows the layout and is actually going to direct me to the correct location. In the distributed environment, in a multi-party compute, excuse me, environment, we have multiple different organizations who host a variety of computers, all of which have to come to consensus in order to agree that the easiest way for Eric to get to the bus station is to go from this place to that place, for example, using the Google Maps example. And so at first, it seems like a very nuanced difference because I think a lot of us have come to rely upon centralized companies on in our day-to-day lives for Web 2 type services. But when you dig a little deeper and look into issues of privacy, security, and even what is our shared communal definition of what is true and what is false, you get into some very philosophical territory about why distributed computing has some significant advantages over centralized computing. And then when you dig even deeper and ask yourself, well, what is it that makes decentralized computing difficult and challenging from a technological perspective, much less from a societal perspective? There's just a tremendous amount of work to be done in order to take all of the centralized systems that we've come to rely upon in our lives and decentralize them and distribute that trust in a way that encourages fairness, non-bias, accuracy, and so on. And so I think that was one of the things that led me down the path of committing to distributed computation for digital human rights. I think some people presume that we as users are only here for them to extract value out of when and resell our data, for example. When in fact, I think most of us would agree that it's a natural human right to want to have privacy, to want to have security, to want to protect your identity, so that it's not taken and confused with someone else, or that others cannot come and steal your resources or your assets, right? So for all of these reasons, distributed computing has become a very important part of our technological future, and something that I think is essential to safeguarding some of these basic human rights that many of us have come to cherish.
Absolutely. When we talk about distributed computing, now, of course, a lot of companies are paying attention towards it. How does
Mm,
Randamu try to be different from all of these competitors? And correct me if
mhm,
I'm wrong. Are there
mhm.
a lot of competitors in this space? If so, what are some of the top players that we see in the market, and what sort of a market share are we looking at for distributed computings? As I know these are a lot of questions in one,
Uh-huh.
but if you can talk about the market share first and then move on to how Randomo is trying to be different from the other players in the market.
Yeah, sure. So, to basically touch on market share, I would say if you consider the possibility that all of the centralized services that we've come to rely on over the course of the last many years in Web 2 could eventually be replaced by decentralized services, then the market shares that we've accomplished at that is very tiny. There's still a tremendous, I would say, less than 5% probably. There's still a tremendous amount of upside, and that's in the aggregate. That's not just Randamu services. That's all services that we'd be thinking about. Um, all of the Web 2 services that we've come to rely on in our day-to-day lives. However, to be more specific, the difference between Randamu and other companies in this space actually hinges on a couple of different differentiators. The first is that we focus on threshold cryptography, and so threshold cryptography, as I mentioned, is a very specialized form of cryptography that is all about bringing multiple party computers to consensus. If you look at some of the competitors in this space, how they accomplish that, they do it. They take some shortcuts that we think are ill-advised. For example, one of our largest competitors that springs to mind has a multi-party computational network where they own all the nodes. And so that kind of goes against the whole point of decentralization. It's almost as if Google said, "Hey, we have a bunch of computers in our data center too. Therefore, we're a multi-party compute network," right? Well, that may meet the technical definition, but it doesn't meet the moral and ethical definition that we aspire to. And so, as a result, one of the things that we did early on was create a group called the League of Entropy. And the League of Entropy is a voluntary consortium of independent organizations who have come together to run nodes on this network to help create an impartial, unbiased, distributed compute network. And today there's almost 25 members of the League of Entropy, all enterprise class, from some of the largest institutions in their various areas. For example, we got our start at EPFL, which is one of the largest research institutions in Switzerland, one of the largest research universities. University of Chile was one of our very first node hosters. Then there's Protocol Labs, of course. Cloudflare, which is one of the largest CDNs, content distribution networks in the world, was an inaugural member of the League of Entropy. And so we've continued to attract a large number of universities, nonprofits, and even for-profit corporations to join the League in an effort to create a sufficiently decentralized network that people can trust. And this is also a significant differentiator from some of our competitors. There are other competitors that do multi-party computing in a variety of different ways, but I would say in most cases, they either do not focus exclusively on threshold, or they're not actually decentralized in the way that you would expect a decentralized party to come together through the use of other members of the community. And then thirdly, in many cases, they don't even apply some of the basic threshold cryptography. So one of my favorite examples is Wormhole. So there's a company called Wormhole that used to have a bridge, and it was the target of a massive, hacking attack that resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars being lost. The reason that happened was because they weren't using threshold cryptography. They had one bridge with one set of keys that was easily exploited. And so what we do is we distribute our keys across all of the nodes of the network so that it becomes very difficult for anybody other than maybe a state level actor to bring the necessary resources to bear in order to try to crack into that network and disrupt its operation. And to the best of our knowledge, this has never happened to a threshold network before. And so that was one of the things that we pride ourselves on, is that every additional node that we bring from another organization extends our security guarantees. And so I think another fundamental difference between Randamu and some of the other companies that operate in this space is how we think about security guarantees. You'll hear a lot from other companies about things like, there's a variety of different styles of cryptography. There's like zero knowledge proofs and fully homomorphic encryption. In some cases, these comparisons don't even make sense because they're apples and oranges talking about two different use cases for cryptography. But in those cases where they do make sense, a lot of times we find that the technology is not quite there. It's very difficult to run. It requires a tremendous amount of resources. And so until our research and development catches up with our ambition there, we believe threshold cryptography is a highly useful, highly practical way of bringing security and privacy to customers in a manner that's still the full benefit of which has still been unrealized. And so that's one of the things that we're focused on as a company, is to bring those benefits to the market as quickly as possible.
Right, you didn't mention the benefits of having that top-notch level or layer of security that Randamu definitely assures, while some of the other companies that are branded as decentralized do not. And I completely agree that with blockchain or AI being the buzzword, a lot of
Hmm.
companies tend use that quite vaguely, while
Hmm.
others are trying to respect one of the pillars of Web3, which is, of course, decentralization as well as privacy, security, all of those, which you rightly mentioned Randamu is doing. But when we talk about mass adoption, Eric, there
Hmm.
is there is a notion where as end users we tend to think that why should we care about decentralization or privacy as long as it's not impacting us. And I completely know about the wormhole hack that happened and what went down,
Hmm.
but to think that the number of users that, let's say, a web3 um, company would have as compared
Hmm.
to a web company are quite few. So why would
Hmm.
the end user care about decentralization or privacy? And
Sure.
what are some of the methods that Randamu is sort of using to make end users care more about privacy, security,
Indeed.
as well
I
as
think, yeah,
decentralization?
that's a great question. And I think the simple fact of the matter is, I think the majority of users will not care. The majority of average people, in the world, don't wake up and tie their shoes in the morning and think about how secure is my cell phone or how secure is my laptop computer. They just go about their business and do their thing, right? So I think it's incumbent upon us as practitioners to meet those users where they're at, and what that means is making this technology dramatically easier to use. In fact, in some ways, superior to existing Web 2 technologies in order to attract and retain a substantial market share. Because at the end of the day, while there is a small number of early adopters who will adopt these new technologies, even though they present some challenges because they're deeply interested in privacy and security and some of the other features that we mentioned, I would say for the vast majority of users, they're not going to think about that when they roll out of bed in the morning. So as a result, we have the difficult task of creating use cases and tooling that will allow them to avail themselves of these benefits transparently and seamlessly and easily. And so, as an example, we're working on some technology right now that would obviate the need for a user to have to fiddle with their wallet in order to conduct a transaction. So, when you think about a very pedestrian example of somebody who wants to play a video game, let's say, there are many Web3 games that are tied to specific blockchains. And so if you come to that Web3 game and you say, hey, I want to play this game, and you click the button, the first thing you're greeted with is like a 10-step process on how you got to go buy some tokens in order to play the game. Well, for most gamers, this would be enough of a turnoff that they would step away and go play another game, right? So unless they're really hardcore Web3 degens, right? And so as a result, we want to create a system whereby they don't have to care about what sort of token that game uses in order to avail themselves of being able to sign up and play it. And so that's why we focus very deeply on cross-chain interoperability. And so the primary use case of our backend is to replace all of these fragile bridges. So as I mentioned earlier, in the case of the wormhole hack, which of course is one of the better known hacks, we would replace these bridges with threshold computational networks. And so instead of having one or a very small number of computers protecting those transactions, we now have a very large and distributed and diverse number of computers protecting such transactions. And so the likelihood of an exploit goes down significantly. It doesn't go to zero, but it gets much more difficult. And that sort of back end technology, coupled with a focus on the end user and how they're actually going to consume this technology in order to benefit themselves, I think is what differentiates us from most of our competitors.
While you talk about tech, can you maybe talk about a few pieces of technology that you're super excited about this year? And I know that you've been from a tech background, you've seen
Mhm.
Microsoft sort of bloom, and now you're finally in the Web3 space, finally a degen. So if you can talk
Uh-huh.
about a few pieces of technology that excite you, that we will probably see by the end of this year, related to random or maybe about the larger sector, that would be great.
Yeah, actually, the ones that I'm most excited about are the ones that make it easier for customers, right? Like I think there's a lot of really cool technology. Like for example, we have some some friends over at Zama working on fully homomorphic encryption, which is a blow your mind kind of technology. When you get into it, you're like, oh my God, I can't imagine something like this exists outside of science fiction, right? Um, but that doesn't excite me personally as much as just getting people on board and actually engaging with users where they're at. And so some of the technologies that I'm excited about include the ways that we're trying to interact with all these different wallets. As you may know, in addition to having an explosion of blockchains and layer twos in the past 12 months, we've also seen an explosion of wallets as well. And so it's our belief that this, while this may be good for the industry in the medium term, it makes it really hard for users in the short term. And so our goal is to consolidate some of that complexity so that they don't have to worry about it, and that they're literally one click away. And so our metaphor that we sometimes use is we compare ourselves to Stripe. So as you may know, in the Web 2 world, Stripe really made their mark by making it easy for developers to take a single line of code and link into Stripe's backend and link into Stripe's infrastructure in order to allow Web 2 vendors to go online so that they could launch the next generation of Web 2 businesses. And in a similar manner, we aspire to do the same thing with our DGen friends who are working on distributed apps, which is we want to give them a single line of code that lets them hook into our network and avail themselves of all these many benefits in a way that is seamless and transparent and easy to use, so that they don't have to work too hard in order to ensure their privacy and security and ease of use, as we discussed. And so if we can do that on the back end while at the same time making it easy to plug into a variety of different wallets on the front end, we believe that we can sort of obfuscate this complexity from the average user so that they don't have to think about it. They can just go click around and do what they normally do in order to avail themselves of these more beneficial technologies. And those tie-ins between the back end and the front end, I think, are what excite me the most.
Yeah, interesting. But as long as you keep it simple, I think that's the way to go, especially for end users.
Yeah.
Talking about the roadmap of Randamu, how
Mhm.
are the next couple of years looking for you guys, and what are some of the developments that you guys are most interested in or
Mhm.
looking forward to?
Yeah, we have a lot of grinding to do in terms of the back end and just plugging into all the existing blockchains and different pieces of middleware that exist out there today. So, for example, we just recently went live on the Filecoin mainnet as well as the Polygon mainnet, and we're live on a wide variety of test nets at the moment. And so, as those begin to flip and go live on mainnet, that will begin to increase the number of interoperability environments that we're able to interoperate with. That's on the back end, and so that's just a continual process of adding new plugins, adding new connections to these different environments. Then on the front end, we have a similar challenge in unifying these wallets and unifying the manner in which end users get to the benefits that they're seeking. And that's by working with dApp developers, by working with wallet developers, and those who have these technologies out there in order to make it easy for. And so we think of it almost as wallet abstraction in a sense, because users don't want to think about the fact that they have a wallet with some tokens in it. They just want to be able to do their work. And so if we can make that process super easy and super intuitive for them, the same way we've come to rely on some other Web 2 technologies in the day, we think that's a winning combination for bringing that change about.
Absolutely. And Eric, finally, you have made that journey or transition from Web 2 to Web 3, which I definitely like to call a rabbit hole. And there's so
Hmm.
many others falling into this rabbit hole. How have you sort of seen this journey through? And if you have any key pieces of advice for entrepreneurs who are entering the
Hmm.
web space, because I feel that there's so many people who want to get into this space because of the quick
Hmm.
success, quick money, maybe things that they
Yeah.
hear from traders and so many
Well,
new
there's
entrepreneurs.
no quick money. I will assure you that. So there's nothing. Yeah, in fact, it all requires hard work. But I would
Absolutely.
say to answer your question directly, I think the most important thing that's helped me personally, have a sense of place here in the Web3 community, is being a constantly learning mode and constantly open, almost having a beginner's mind, right? Because there are so many things that I think a Web 2 person, so many preconceived notions and biases that we sort of bring to our work that get undone in the world of Web 3 and that need to be reconsidered fully. And so as a result, I found that the only way I'm able to do that is to constantly be open to learning new things and to be inquisitive and try to find out why and how things work, and to also be very aware of my own personal bias and try to put that aside in order to really get to the deeper truth of what's happening. And I would say the thing that shocks me the most about Web3, and it's something we laugh on my team. We often tease one another to this day. Like, one of us will make a statement. We'll say like, "Oh, the sky is blue." We'll make some super obvious statement that everybody thinks is true, right? And then all of a sudden, somebody will come up and they'll go, "Oh no, actually, there's another blockchain, and there the sky is red." And then people are like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know the sky could be red." And I mean, that's kind of a silly metaphor, but the point is, we are constantly uncovering new technologies and new things that are happening in the community that fundamentally challenge what we thought was true literally the day before. And so and when you're in an environment where change is that constant and that disruptive and that crazy, you can't help but be humble and just try to always. So like, I stopped using words like always and must and very, because every time I use one of those words, I'm wrong, generally speaking, right? And so I often say things like, I always preface some of my statements like, "to the best of our knowledge," or "as far as we know," because literally, there's always new stuff popping up every day. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a conversation with somebody and said, "Oh, I believe this is true." And then the very next day, something comes out and it's like, "Guess what? You were wrong. It's not true anymore." And so I just find to be in an environment that is so progressing so rapidly and has so much innovation, and things are happening every single day. It's just very humbling, because I think eventually you figure out that you're never going to learn all of this stuff. And there used to be a time when developers could say, "Hey, I'm going to learn this one language and I'll be the master of C++ or whatever, and I'll be better than all the other engineers." And that just is impossible today, right? Like, that doesn't happen anymore, because there's so much complexity and so much things that are happening, and so many cross connections between these different environments that it's hard to wrap your head around. It's hard for one single person to wrap their head around what's actually going on. And so, building a community, building a team, having friends in different places that you can ping for different ideas, or having sources of information like Money and Me, for example, in your life, I think is very important, because it's the only way you can kind of stay up to date with what's happening. And so those types of resources become invaluable.
Absolutely. And I think you rightly said change is the only constant. And we're seeing that more now than we ever did in this world. And with
Mm,
so much happening across us, there's only one way that we can get through this, I think, whirlwind, and that's by staying educated and by being humble, which you
mm.
rightly mentioned. And this space does tend to humble you every now and then. So anyone who's joining new tends to be initially very confident, but then they'll at some point get that blow of
Yeah.
the change that's taking place around us. But Eric, this has definitely been a great conversation. And do you have any final words for our listeners or users? Anything that you'd like to share about Randamu or yourself?
Yeah, I think it's important to come to, for those that are new to Web3, particularly, but even those that are still that have been in it for some time. I think it's important to establish what sort of principles that you stand for, because you will be challenged in a variety of ways, not just intellectually or technologically, but also sometimes people will step back and ask, like, "Oh my gosh, why are we doing this? Like, what's the point?" Or "This seems crazy." And so it's helped me a great deal to have a sense of principle, and why you get up and tie your shoes in the morning every day, to come to work and to actually engage with these technologies, and try to make the world a better place, try to help users and customers. And so I think as long as you are clear on what your principles are, you'll be able to navigate this vast array of complexity in these changing times that can be very challenging, even for the best of us, right? And so I think knowing why you're doing what you're doing, and having that sorted out before you jump in with both feet, has been very helpful to me personally. And so I would encourage others to think about that as well. I came in this because I wanted to promulgate digital human rights, and that was a something that I felt very personally passionate about, and that resonated with me as an individual. And I think if others can find that similar guiding light, or north star, you might say, that having those principles will guide them through the tumultuous days of getting bandied about by all these new technological developments, right? And so that would be my advice to, particularly to newcomers, or to people who find themselves in Web3 today and are just like utterly confused and bewildered, because that can happen as well, right? And so just remember why you're here and what we're trying to accomplish as a community. And I think that's definitely gotten me through some tough times. So that would be my best advice.
Wow, Eric, you really beautifully put it forward. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people forget in the hustle culture or trying to be successful or make money. That's one thing that a lot of people forget. But as long as you keep your principles tight and close, I feel there are no mountains that you cannot climb. So thank you so
Hmm.
much for putting this out there for all our audiences and all your audiences as well. And I do feel that Ranbo is working towards some amazing things that our listeners should definitely look at, and definitely also check out Eric. I'm sure that he's available to answer any
Mhm.
queries or questions that you might have about Ranmu or the space at large. Once again, thank you so much for joining us on the Coin Republic's podcast, Eric. It was my absolute pleasure to host you today.